people like me. You need people like me so you can point your fucking fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. Eddie Hearn says Katie Taylor versus Amanda Serrano rematch should be next. Would be just as good.
Yeah, we've talked about this.
I think that's definitely the biggest fight out there for Katie still. Hearn told a small group of reporters at the MGM Grand. I mean, I think now with Katie, the only other things you can talk about is, the crossover fights. You're talking about Holly Holm, Chris Cyborg, these kinds of fights. But in boxing, the Serrano rematch is still by far the biggest fight out there for her. So I think that, she needs to. Everybody needs to be. I don't want to say be sensible, because that sounds like they should take whatever money they're offered. But at the end of the day, we know what margins were made from the first fight. And in order to improve the offer for both girls, the revenue must improve on the fight, which it should. It might. But we have to have those conversations. The gate, the zone, and if the revenue can increase.
That addresses the inconvenient side of things.
The business side of things. The fight drew out something like 19,000 people.
That's good.
A little over. And, the fight was allowed time to grow, mostly because the first time they tried to do the fight, Amanda Serrano walked away. She didn't like the money.
Double-edged sword.
Cause for criticism on one end, beneficial towards the fight's overall growth on the other. Eddie Hearn stated, we have to have those conversations, the gate, the zone, and if the revenue can increase, so too can the purses around the fight. Amanda lost. Normally, if you lost, you'd take less money for the rematch, but her value went up incredibly in the fight, so maybe she gets more money. Katie Taylor will definitely get more money. She won the fight, but where's the money going to come from? If we can find it, if it's there, we'll give it to them.
The only place they can draw a bigger crowd than they just did at Madison Square Garden would have to be Ireland.
Which may be a bit inconvenient for Amanda taking on Katie Taylor in Katie Taylor's neck of the woods, where a sizable portion of her supporters are. Eddie Hearn stated, I think it should be next. I mean, we're talking about Croke Park, for example, in Ireland. It could be in October. I mean, outdoors in October is a non-starter, so really if you're going outdoors in Croke Park, you need to be there by middle September, really. And that's not a long period of time. I mean, luckily, Katie had her scans. I thought she might have broken her jaw, but she didn't. She got the all clear. But still, if you're going to fight in mid-September, you've got a month off. It's not a huge period of time. We've had some approaches from the Middle East to do that fight as well, which would be quite iconic.
And financially lucrative for them.
Madison Square Garden also said, whatever you do, don't do the rematch anywhere else but here. So they're in a great position.
Given the turnout, they set the bar really high for themselves.
They did. The level of interest around the fight exceeded even my expectations, and I actually expected that the fight would do well. It would do well commercially. The metrics would be generous, the viewership.
Both fighters are going to want to get paid handsome.
So you got to do the fight in a place that makes that possible, where that money's actually there. It's on the table in order for the fighters to be paid handsomely. They can run it back in Madison Square Garden for a second time, or they can explore other options. If you have any questions as to whether or not women's boxing has just any interest at all from investors over there in the Middle East, keep in mind that very soon Delphine Persoon and Ella Mechaled are going to be locking horns there.
Estelle Mosley versus Yanina Lascano was over there in Dubai.
Last year, American bantamweight Casey Morton, experienced fighter, she traveled to Dubai to take on Urvashi Singh.
We've seen an interest to not just bring women's boxing to the Middle East, but boxing overall.
And out there in the Middle East, there may actually be some financial opportunities for the fighters.
Although the bottom line is, if you want more money for the rematch, the money has to actually be there.
It's a business. Eddie Hearn added, I do think we should all try and make the rematch somehow, Hearn said. Such a good fight. And the next one would be just as good, honestly. There'd be no change in the next fight. It would be exactly the same. And I beg to differ. I think that the second fight would have somewhat of the same aesthetic as the first one, but it all boils down to which fighter can make adjustments. The first Katie Taylor versus Delphine Persoon fight, and the second one. You know, a lot of people feel that maybe Delphine Persoon did enough to win the fight, or at minimum, she did enough to earn a draw, whereas Katie beat her more decisively the second time out. In a rematch situation, rematches tend to be decided by the fighter that can make the most adjustments.
The outcomes of rematches.
Katie Taylor had to make adjustments for that second Delphine Persoon fight, that rematch, because that first fight was a punishing fight. She looked more human than she'd ever looked. With Amanda Serrano, it's a very similar situation. She came very close to being stopped in that fifth.
Yeah, it's a wonder if she made it out of that round.
Which I think speaks directly to what Katie Taylor said ahead of the fight, that, you know, at some point, her and Amanda, they're going to be in the trenches, deep in the trenches. And the difference between them is that Katie's been there before. She's been there more times than Amanda, even though Amanda's been in the sport of pro boxing longer than Katie. I think time has proven Katie Taylor right, because only experience and survival instincts.
She made it out of that fifth round.
Katie Taylor has had to weather the storm in some uncomfortable situations, some uncomfortable fights. The Jessica McCaskill fight, the Christina Leonardo II fight, the two Delphine Persoon fights.
That's the benefit of consistently dealing with top-level opponents, top-level competition.
That if things start to get messy, there's no need to panic. If things start to get messy, you can deal because you've dealt with messy situations, difficult ones, uncomfortable ones. You've dealt with them before.
Experience is the best teacher.
I favored Katie Taylor to win the first fight on points. She did that. I'd favor her to win the rematch even more decisively, because now she knows firsthand what Amanda Serrano can do. She knows that Amanda can hurt her, and now she knows it doesn't behoove her to trade punches with Amanda deep in the pocket, so long as she's moving and punching and boxing.
She can slow the fight down and win the rounds.
You know, Amanda Serrano, she had success in that fight. She actually hurt Katie, and in a second fight, in a rematch situation, she'd be looking to hurt Katie again. She'd be looking to finish the job, so you got a good idea what she means to do in a rematch situation. The thing about Katie is Katie's got more than one way of fighting a fight.
She can box or she can brawl.
She found out the hard way it doesn't behoove her to brawl with Amanda Serrano. Staying on the balls of her feet, boxing and punching, working off the counter, that's the way to go.
It might sound like I'm oversimplifying things.
Oversimplification, but rematches and their outcomes, they usually are determined by the fighter that can make the most adjustments. I happen to think that fighter's Katie Taylor.
In any event, let's see if they can't get the rematch over the line.
Said it before and I'll say it again. Amanda Serrano's stock has considerably gone up to where she can do the second fight with Katie Taylor, or she can return to featherweight and see about becoming that division's undisputed champion. I wouldn't mind seeing that either.
Wait and see what happens.
In other news, I'm sure most of you have heard by now, per tweet from Michael Benson, Kell Brook has announced that he's now retired from boxing at age 36. Following his win over Amir King Khan, he said, "I'd just like to be remembered as a fighter who would go in there with anyone, feared no one, and who gave the fans what they wanted."
And I do think that's true of Kell Brook, more so than it's true for some other fighters.
When he won the red belt, when he won the IBF title from Sean Porter, he did it on the road. He came to America for that fight. You think about what happened between Gennady Golovkin and Chris Eubank Jr., rather, what didn't happen, and how Kell Brooks decided to stand in for that guy. He didn't have to do that. He didn't have to take on a prime Gennady Golovkin at what seemed to be then the height of his popularity, the height of his powers and physical prowess. But Kell Brook, he took that guy on, and he didn't have to.
I think that fight changed the course of Kell Brook's career.
I think that had Kell Brook not decided to stand in for Chris Eubank Jr., had he decided to just leave the welterweight division, vacate the IBF title, and start a campaign at junior middleweight, a better weight, I think, for Kell Brook, I think it would have been, maybe we wouldn't be hearing this retirement news by now. You know, Kell, he's been in some wars. He got stopped by Gennady Golovkin. He got stopped by Errol Spence Jr., stopped by Terrence Crawford. Kell Brook, who says, "It's over for me. I'll never box again." The 36-year-old Brook told the paper, "It's a little emotional to be actually saying this out loud. My mom is relieved. I think everyone around me is pleased. Truth is, boxing is a very, very tough, dangerous sport. One in which you can be legally killed in the ring. I've finished now with all my faculties intact."
It's a fairy tale
You're
ending.
about as close to one as you can aspire to, about as close to one as you can hope for, given the circumstances. Kell Brook has won some fights, he's lost some fights.
But he's retiring on his own terms. He's retiring on a high.
And it's not the sport retiring him. Kell, who says, I needed the Khan fight. I needed to settle the grudge, the feud, Brook said. There is no dark feeling left in me now. I think when you have been in the ring with someone, it passes, it leaves you. Me and Amir said some words which were hateful in the build-up, but that's what happens in boxing. I respect him after the fight. He showed real heart in there.
After that fight, there were talks of a potential rematch.
And you know, I said it ahead of the fight. I said it beforehand. A second fight between Kell Brook and Amir Khan is contingent upon the aesthetic of the first fight, and we saw what the first fight looked like. Kell Brook was ragdolling Amir Khan. Amir Khan looked like he had nothing left, so in spite of the attention and the revenue that the first fight generated, whatever it garnered, which turned out to be a commercial success, by the way. In spite of all of that, you can't do the second fight because the audience doesn't want to see a second fight. Not behind what they just saw in the first fight.
Oh, the build-up to the first fight was great.
Lots of bad blood between both boys, years in the making. Some felt that the fight should have happened sooner, and I won't argue with those people. I think it should have happened sooner too, when both boys were at the height of their powers, but the feud between them was good enough, had enough sizzle, that even
though they were both past their prime, people still wanted to see them fight. People still wanted to know.
As to whether or not he could still return, he being Amir Khan, Kell Brook told the Telegraph he was at peace with his decision, and he added, I'd just like to be remembered as a fighter who would go in with anyone, feared no one, and who gave the fans what they wanted, and I think that is very much true.
Yeah, Kell Brook don't duck no smoke.
I don't think a lot of people were expecting Kell to retire, though. His name was involved in a lot of different conversations, well, at least two conversations, a potential Chris Eubank Jr. fight, which reportedly went cold very recently, and now we know why.
Retired.
And a potential Conor Benn fight, both fights in the United Kingdom.
Kell Brook had options.
But I do think he's making the right decision, I do. You know, the sport has a way of retiring its fighters before they even get to make that decision for themselves. Kell took the bull by the horns, as he usually does, and he made the decision for himself at a time where he does have options, lucrative ones, that could have saw him sticking around for at least one or two more fights.
Yeah.
I'm sure he made very good money taking on his domestic rival, Amir Khan. He's made peace with himself, the situation, and the sport, and he's ready to hang the gloves up. Best wishes to him, though that does leave Chris Eubank Jr. in a bit of a predicament, bit of a dilemma. They wanted to put Kell Brook in there with Chris. I myself didn't think the fight made much sense. Chris Eubank Jr. has campaigned as high as super middleweight. This fight would have been a middleweight contest, somewhere between 160 and 154 pounds.
I didn't think it made sense for Kell Brook to, at this point in his career, leave himself at a disadvantage like that.
The Conor Benn fight made more sense to me. Just above welterweight. Conor Benn, he's a young guy. It won't hurt him. And in that situation, I felt that Kell Brook would have been the A-side fighter who brings most of the marquee value to the table, the name value, to where maybe those two guys can meet, fight just above 147 pounds, maybe at 149.
That made more sense to me than fighting Chris Eubank.
But you know, we see how it all turned out. Kell Brook is now retired. Conor Benn is courting a potential Jose Ramirez fight, and they're currently in talks with Top Rank to see if they can't get a fight like that over the line. But when it comes to Chris Eubank Jr., I think this most inconveniences Chris, more so than it inconveniences anyone else, because now you really have to wonder, who's he gonna fight?
He's over there on the Sky Sports side of things, and they ain't got the inside track on the middleweight.
It's a fragmented division that has been fragmented for years now, and the biggest name in the middleweight division, Gennady Golovkin, well, he just fought Ryota Murata. He's still on the Matchroom DAZN side of things.
Yeah, I don't know what they're gonna be able to do for Chris.
He finds himself in a different situation than young Conor Benn, because Chris is at a stage in his career where he really should be fighting for an alphabet title or alphabet titles, as opposed to Conor Benn, who has plenty of time to still climb up those ranks and climb up that ladder and have those necessary experience fights with either a Jose Ramirez or somebody else. You know, Chris is really in a pickle.
No, he's 32 years old.
And he's never held one of the major four alphabet titles, the WBA, the WBC, the WBO, or the IBF, and he's 32 years old. At this stage in Chris Eubank Jr.'s career, that's really what he should be aiming for.
There don't seem to be any money fights for him.
And very soon, Top Rank's own Yanibek Alim Kanuli will be taking on unbeaten Danny Dignam for what is the WBO title. I think that given Top Rank's relationship with Sky Sports as their UK broadcast partner, the network relationship exists to where if Yanni Beck ends up winning the brown belt, they should see about doing a fight between him and Chris Eubank Jr. In the United Kingdom, where the fight stands to make the most money, it's a risky fight for Chris, no doubt about it, who's a more experienced professional than Yanni Beck is, though all things considered.
To make an omelet, you gotta crack a couple of eggs.
Chris Eubank Jr. doesn't really have the luxury of choice the way that young Conor Benn does. All things considered, Chris ain't got that many options, and that's about one of the best fights he could be involved in right now.
That's the fallout as a result of Kell Brook retiring.
Chris Eubank Jr. doesn't have him to turn to. Not anymore. Finally, yesterday, we saw a bit of an exchange between reigning unified super featherweight champion Shakur Stevenson and Gervonta Davis ahead of what is Gervonta Davis's upcoming fight with Rolly Romero. In so many words, Gervonta Davis hinted at a potential return to 130 pounds, which I don't even really think is realistic, but that's what he hinted at. And to that, Shakur Stevenson replied, let's do it. Let's have a fight.
I like the fight.
It would be one of the more high-profile fights you could put on anywhere at or around these weights. Fight between these two young guys, two southpaws, Shakur Stevenson and Gervonta Davis. Being honest, I really like Shakur Stevenson's chances in this fight because
he'd undress Gervonta Davis.
Gervonta wouldn't have any advantages in this fight, He'd be facing another southpaw like himself, so he doesn't really have that to build upon. Neither guy is all that prolific a puncher, combination puncher. Gervonta's not much of a combination puncher.
He's a pot shot guy.
Shakur's not much of a combination puncher either, you understand. But what Gervonta Davis likes to do is pick his punches to where he can land something hard and then pour it on, then start putting punches together. But he's got to land hard first, and against a defensively responsible southpaw like Shakur Stevenson, he wouldn't have very many openings to do that.
You're always hearing about how strong Gervonta is and how fast Gervonta is.
Now, I don't think Shakur Stevenson is a stronger puncher than Gervonta Davis, but I do think he's a better boxer, and I think he can match his speed, if not surpass it.
Don't forget that it took Gervonta Davis 12 rounds to stop a one-legged Yurioriki Scamboa.
A guy who's little more than a journeyman these days. He was fighting with a torn Achilles tendon, standing on one leg, and it took Gervonta Davis 12 rounds to put that guy away. In his last fight with Isaac Cruz, a guy that comes forward, a guy who's nowhere near as defensively responsible as Shakur Stevenson, a guy who's nowhere near as difficult to read. Come forward guy, pressure guy. Gervonta couldn't stop him, so he's going to stop Shakur Stevenson.
No, I don't think so.
You want to know what else I don't think? I don't think this conversation matters in the least bit because I don't think this fight is going to happen. There's all this talk about what Gervonta Davis is going to do beyond the Rolly Romero fight, that this is supposed to be the last fight under Gervonta's existing contract with Mayweather Promotions. Do you guys really get the sense that he's going to cross the street over to Top Rank so he has to work for his money as opposed to being matched baby soft the way he has been?
What do you think? He's going to go to Top Rank? He's going to go to Matchroom?
I'm not against it. I welcome the change and what that could herald if Gervonta Davis were to leave Mayweather Promotions and the PBC altogether and change his decorum. I'm not against any of that.
But that doesn't mean I'm expecting it to happen either.
The change everybody's talking about could be a nominal change in decorum to where maybe he's not promoted by Mayweather Promotions anymore, what seems to be a subsidiary of the PBC. Maybe he just jumps into bed with Tom Brown. Tom Brown, which is just another way of saying Al Heyman.
Leaving Mayweather Promotions doesn't necessarily mean leaving the PBC is Showtime.
Once again, we're sitting here talking about what might happen between Gervonta Davis and some other fighter that in all likelihood he won't end up fighting. We're having this conversation just so he can end up fighting Rolly Romero.
Why even bother?
Yeah, Stevenson versus Davis is a good fight, but it's also not likely.